Well, a week has passed since resurrection morning. And with sunnier and warmer weather, it even feels a bit more Eastery this weekend than it did last weekend, doesn't it? We didn't have a string quartet, we don't have the Hallelujah chorus today, and there aren't 407 people in the pews, but we had the brass. The cross is still draped in white. We have a few stray lilies scattered about, and you are here. You are here on what is sometimes considered the lowest attendance Sunday of the year. So pat yourself on the back. If nothing else, the fact that you all rose up out of bed, rolled the stone of excuses away, and got to church is a sign that Christ is risen indeed. I'm not really sure why the Sunday after Easter is considered the lowest attendance Sunday of the year. I don't know who keeps track of such things. It certainly doesn't make sense. Usually Easter Sunday in most churches, it's this grand extravaganza. It's a wonderful worship event that hopefully leaves people feeling energized and hopeful. And so you would think that after a service like that, you'd want to come back for more the next week. People wanting to exercise more and eat less make it longer with their New Year's resolutions in January than we Christians do in attending church to celebrate Easter. Because you know, Easter is a season. It's not just one day. Eastertide, the season of celebrating the risen Christ, is 50 days long, and it will go up until Pentecost, which is the season of celebrating the church that has arisen in Christ's name. Well, that's your liturgical education for now. I'm preaching to the choir, I realize. But the point is, Easter is not just about resurrection morning. It's about looking for signs of the risen Lord out in the world and choosing to see them as signs of hope and life that draw us deeper into faith and deeper into connection with one another. We modern-day disciples are not alone in our struggle to ride the resurrection high for more than just a day. It seems that Jesus' first disciples couldn't even celebrate for more than a fleeting moment, let alone a full day. Our text today begins where we left off last week, with the gospel writer John reporting that after her up-close and personal encounter with Jesus outside the empty tomb, Mary went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them everything that had happened. Well, John keeps writing. When it was evening on that same day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them. The very same day that the disciples heard the first resurrection sermon from Mary, they were not celebrating with joy, but instead were cowering behind closed doors in fear. 2,000 plus years later, the only way we can understand this sort of response is to put ourselves in their position. Last spring, Damon and I saw The 12. It's a rock musical that imagines what happened with the 12 disciples immediately following Jesus' death. Writer Robert Shinkin says, "We wrote this musical because it's an interesting aspect of the Passion story, which is not usually dramatized. It's after the crucifixion, and everything has gone to you-know-what in a handbasket. The disciples had arrived in Jerusalem as part of this triumphant movement, but now their leader is dead. They are being hunted themselves. And everything they've believed in and sacrificed their lives for has blown up. Because the disciples are all trapped in one room, this story is intense," he says. The central question of our musical is this: when the head of this revolutionary group is suddenly killed, what makes these followers continue on. We have all experienced a dark night of the soul, a time where everything we have believed in, whether it's a religious expression or an idea or a cause, has failed us. And we have to find a way to go forward, to recover our faith and our belief. That's at the heart of this musical, he says. So, the musical, The 12, does imagine the hours between the crucifixion and the resurrection. It doesn't venture into the appearances of the risen Christ to the disciples. But we can't understand the impact of the appearance of Jesus to his disciples if we first do not understand just how terrified the disciples were. It reminds me of modern-day images of students trapped in classrooms in a lockdown because of a suspected shooter. Or countries where the violence of terrorism has succeeded in doing what it does best, instilling fear into people, so much so that they cannot live their normal lives. They don't want to venture out of their homes or go to public places. They are afraid. We are afraid. The disciples were afraid. Not only were they directly linked to their leader, who had just been killed at the hands of those in power, and therefore they were likely targets too, they were also grappling with the psychological and emotional reality that they had left their friends and families and given their heart and life to someone, something, to God's kingdom, they thought. And now they have no idea who they are or what they've done with the last 3 years of their life, or how they will move forward, if they can move forward. And of course, they're grieving deeply for their loss of their close friend and teacher. It's no wonder they were locked up in a room, and that one person saying, "I have seen the Lord," doesn't convince them it's safe to come out. The entombed fear is the overriding feeling of that first Easter. Not the trumpeting lily-white joy we all feel on Easter. We have years of history on our side, and we have the disciples' testimonies beyond that first day. But they, on that first day of the week, all they had was the grief and fear and confusion of one another. Until Jesus showed up. And when he showed up, he didn't just say, "See, I told you so." He doesn't accuse them of betraying him, or denying him, or falling asleep on him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He doesn't say, "Why didn't you believe Mary this morning when she said she had seen me? If it had been a man and not a woman, would you have believed?" No, Jesus doesn't say any of the stuff that we might say. He comes to the disciples on their turf. He shows them his still tender wounds, and he says, "Peace be with you." The disciples don't have to do anything. They don't even have to open up the locked door for Jesus. It's as if Jesus knows that knocking on the door will not work, that they probably wouldn't let him in or would question who he was or why he was there. So Jesus just appears miraculously and without fanfare, as Jesus does. He meets the disciples where they are, locked up and afraid, and he breathes the spirit of life back into them. And then he does it all again. Jesus shows up a second time in the exact same way, just appearing in the room, not knocking at the door, and says, "Peace be with you." Then Jesus invites Thomas, who missed out on the whole first round. He invites Thomas to physically touch his wounds. Jesus knew what Thomas needed. Now, through the years, Thomas has gotten dubbed as a doubter, even though he doesn't doubt anything. In fact, he's the only disciple that says out loud upon seeing Jesus, "My Lord and my God." We actually have a verbal confession of his belief. Other than Mary, we don't have that kind of exclamation of belief with other disciples. And they didn't take Mary on her word that she had seen Jesus. So why do we think it's so odd that Thomas didn't take them on their word that they had seen Jesus? Remember the circumstances again, all the fear, all the uncertainty. And after all, even though these other disciples had seen Jesus, they were still hunkering down in a locked room 1 week later. It's clear that things didn't automatically get better just because they saw Jesus. They needed a different kind of experience, perhaps a more vulnerable one. And so here Jesus came again to show them his wounds, and this time to invite them to touch them. They don't know it, but Jesus is wanting to heal them of their fear, and he can only do so authentically by vulnerably exposing his wounds, by reminding them that he knows what it's like to be deathly afraid too, all too well. Jesus is vulnerably present with them so that they can draw close enough to him to really see who he is and hear what he's saying, and maybe even begin to hear their story in his story. The Gospels tell us that the only way the risen Lord is known and experienced is through personal encounter. That's the point of the incarnation. That's why God came in human form. And the beauty of this physical presence is that it is not one of perfection or pretense. It's one of honesty and authenticity. Jesus doesn't try to be a superhero, although he certainly could claim that status. He instead reminds them that he has been victimized, but has chosen not to remain a victim. And with his wounds, not his words, he invites them to do the same. Here's an interesting question. Why weren't the marks of the wounds erased by the power of the resurrection? One would think that the glorified body of the risen Christ would be perfect in every sense, thus devoid of any scars from the past. But evidently not. The marks of the wounds remain, without any explanation given. They are there as enduring signs of the faithful love of Christ and of his real participation in the suffering that marks the life of all of us. The Latin word for wound is vulnus, from which we get our English word vulnerable, which simply means capable of being wounded or open to attack or damage. The wounds of the risen Christ show his vulnerability, his ability to be wounded by other people and by life itself. And when he shows them to his disciples, when he shows them his wounds, he's being vulnerable all over again. Because, really, who wants to show other people our wounds, our deepest pains, and our shame? And yet, according to psychologist Carl Jung, that's what we need to do. He's the one that coined the phrase, wounded healer. He said, a good half of every treatment of a patient consists in the doctor's examining himself. It is his own hurt that gives a measure of his power to heal. It is only by being willing to face, consciously experience, and go through our wound that we receive a blessing. And only then can we help others feel the depths of their wounds, to help them grow from them and ultimately heal. He says to go through our wound is to embrace and say yes to the mysteriously painful new place in ourselves where the wound is leading us. If we do this, we allow ourselves to be recreated. Well, theologian and pastor Henry Nouwen wrote a book entitled Wounded Healer, and he adapted that phrase from Jung as a means of explaining Christian ministry. He said it's an illusion to think that a person can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there. Our lives are filled with examples telling us that true Christian community requires such sharing, such vulnerability. Compassion means the full immersion into the condition of being human, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And those who can articulate these movements inside them, those who can really see what's going on, well, they're able to create space for God's Spirit. The Spirit whose heart is greater than their own, whose eyes see more than their own eyes can see, and whose hands can heal more than their own hands can heal. This is what Jesus has the courage to do, to show his wounds to those closest to him. You know, he doesn't know how they will react, if they'll be grossed out or turned off. But he risks showing them because he knows that the presence of his wounds will create a safe space for the disciples to let their guard down and to look at their own wounds too, and maybe even to begin to share them with one another. He's trying to create space for God's Spirit right now where there's only space for fear. And the only way for them to get past their fear and grief and to unlock that door is for them to have this safe space to admit their fear and express their grief, to acknowledge the shock of what has happened and what is happening even now. They're unable to provide that for one another because, they're still wounded themselves. They can't help one another in the same way that Jesus can. But he makes his vulnerability not about him, but about healing. That's why he doesn't say, "I am the risen Lord," or "Look at me." He says, "Peace be with you." This is about the disciples and what they need. It's not about Jesus. They need peace for their fears and hurts before they can even begin to fathom the resurrection. And so in being the presence of Christ to one another, we can bring this peace too. What is most deep within ourselves speaks to what is most deep in others. Surely you've experienced this in sharing with someone what's going on in your life, and then they open up too in a way that wouldn't have happened if that space had not been created by your vulnerability. But often these things, this space, well, it can't be expressed in words. It's merely about being present with one another. On our On Being episode, Krista Tippett interviewed the Quaker Parker Palmer about depression. Parker Palmer has written a book called Let Your Life Speak. It's a wonderful short little treatise, if you will, about discovering what your true calling is in life. But chapter 4 is about his bout with depression, saying you have to go down before you can go up, at least for him. And she's interviewing him and asking him about that passage. And she says, "Tell me about that friend who helped you the most, the one who would just come be with you." And he said, right, I had folks coming to me, of course, who wanted to be helpful, and sadly, many of them weren't. These were the people who would say, gosh, Parker, why are you sitting here being depressed? It's a beautiful day outside. Go, feel the sunshine, smell the flowers. And that, of course, leaves a depressed person even more depressed, because while you know intellectually that it's sunny out and that the flowers smell good, you can't really feel any of that when you're depressed. Those sensations are gone. And so you're left more depressed by this, quote, good advice to get out, enjoy the day. And then there's the other people who come by and say something like, gosh, Parker, why are you depressed? You're such a good person. You've helped so many people. You've written so well. You're so successful. And that, he said, would leave me feeling depressed because I'd think, gosh, I've just defrauded another person. If they really knew what a schmuck I was, well, they would cast me into the darkness too. But there was this one friend who came to me every afternoon at 4 o'clock. He sat me down in the chair in my living room, took off my socks and shoes, and just massaged my feet. He rarely said a word. But if he did, he said things like, I can feel your struggle today. Or, I feel that you're a little stronger at this moment, and I'm glad for that. Parker said that this man would give no advice. He would simply share with Parker not only the gift of that massage, but also what he was intuiting from Parker's body, what he was feeling, the strength or the weakness or the struggle. He said somehow he found the one place in my body, namely the soles of my feet, where I could experience some sort of connection to another human being. And the act of massaging my feet in a way that I really don't have words for kept me connected with another human and to my own humanity. This kind of vulnerability is courageous. It takes a lot to show up like that for a friend, doesn't it? It takes a lot to allow a friend to see ourselves in pain. But hear this hope. Whatever overwhelms us, any of us, on this post-Easter week, God sees us and comes to us in the midst of our fear and says, peace be with you. Whatever doubts churn in our minds, whatever sins trouble our conscience, whatever pain and worry and grief binds us up, whatever walls we have put up in our lives, whatever doors we have locked securely to keep others out, God sees us and says to us, peace be with you. And whatever hunger and need we need to feel deep in our souls, God sees us and calls us to this table to feed us what we need. At the table, we can see visibly Jesus' wounds. But at the table, his wounds become for us an invitation to wholeness, to healing, and to hope. Henry Nouwen concludes in his book, The Wounded Healer, that a Christian community is a healing community, not because our wounds are cured or our pains are alleviated. We can only hope, right? A Christian community is a healing community because in sharing our wounds and pains, they become for us openings and occasions for new vision. Our mutual confession becomes a mutual deepening of hope. And our shared weakness becomes a reminder to one and all of the living Christ who always meets us where we are, who reveals his wounds to us so that we feel safe enough to reveal our own, and who uses that place of old hurt and death to bring forth new healing and life. May it be so for you this day. Amen.